Tonight we shall delve into the gritty, shadowy underbelly of the golden age of seafaring, a tale far from the glittering legends of Hollywood. Forget the pirate heroes and treasure maps of cinematic lore. Those seemingly grand adventures were steeped in the reek of tar and the ache of weary bones. The truth is, voyages weren't always ended by sea monsters or pirate cannonballs, but by silent enemies lurking within the crew. So before you settle in, do give a thumbs up and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy my content. Then drop a comment with your time zone and the night sky above you. It's always fascinating to see global audiences joining in. Now, dim the lights, and let us embark upon tonight's voyage together. Before becoming a terror of the open seas, scurvy was an ancient companion of human life on land. This disease arose from deprivation rather than famine, like a spectre haunting civilization's fringes, silently ravaging corners where the rhythms of the earth were forgotten or ignored. Long before the first great ships ventured into uncharted waters, this affliction was recognized, though not understood. Ancient observers discerned its presence. In the 5th century BC, Hippocrates observed the condition among soldiers returning from prolonged campaigns, documenting foul breath, loose gums, and bleeding beneath the skin of the legs. He noted how robust men were overcome by profound weakness and exhaustion, yet he could not name the cause, only describe its effect: the slow, inexorable decay of living flesh. This affliction, later termed scurvy, cast its shadow over any community cut off from the earth's fresh bounty. Imagine the Roman legions garrisoned at the empire's winter frontier, perhaps near Hadrian's Wall, where icy winds howled down from the grain north and the earth froze for months. These soldiers were disciplined, well-minus supplied, exemplars of the logistical marvels of their age. They stockpiled grain sufficient for the winter, an unending supply of wine and olive oil, and tons of salted meat and fish. They were not starving. Yet as winter deepened, a strange affliction crept upon the garrison. It began with bone-minus deep weariness, a fatigue that sleep could not assuage. Soldiers complained of aching joints and phantom pains and old wounds. Dark purple bruises then appeared on their calves, as if struck by blows that never were. Gums swelled and turned deep purple. Skin became spongy and soft, bleeding at the slightest touch. Some bit into hard bread, only to have teeth fall out painlessly, like loose pebbles. The camp infirmary filled with men suffering neither injury nor fever, yet gradually disintegrating. Roman physicians trained in Galen's medicine stood helpless. They might prescribe bloodletting or dietary adjustments, but all efforts proved futile. Soldiers grew gaunt despite ample rations, their bodies disintegrating from within, all because they lacked a simple green leaf or a fresh fruit, things beyond their reach. This pattern repeated throughout history, proving particularly brutal during medieval sieges and castle assaults. Medieval besieged cities became breeding grounds for scurvy. When attackers encircled the walls, they severed the city's lifeline. Rural fields, orchards, and vegetable gardens became enemy territory. Granaries within the walls might still hold provisions, and cellars stocked with cured meats and smoked fish could sustain survival for a time. Yet, as weeks stretched into months, fresh produce vanished entirely. The last apples and cabbages were consumed, leaving only preserved and dried foods. This horror was vividly documented during the Crusades. In the Fifth Crusade of 1218, Christian forces endured a prolonged and brutal siege at Damietta in Egypt. Trapped within their own encampments, their supply lines grew increasingly strained. The chronicler Jacques David rewitnessed the rampant disease with horror, describing soldiers with gums so swollen and ulcerated that putrid flesh completely covered their teeth, which had rotted black and were utterly useless for eating. Their legs were racked by such agony that they screamed in their sleep, their skin mottled with dark bruises as if beaten. He recounted how barbarous surgical practitioners were compelled to tour the encampments with knives, excising the blackened, putrid tissue from soldiers' mouths to enable them to eat. This was not swift death upon the battlefield, but a slow and humiliating personal collapse. It was an isolated affliction, a punishment for those arrogant armies and cities that fancied themselves subsisting on bread and salted pork alone. Scurvy was the earth's silent vengeance upon the forgetful, delivering its lesson in besieged cities, military camps, and the depths of winter. The pride of armies and city-minded states who believed they could survive on bread and salted pork alone. Scurvy is the earth's silent vengeance upon the forgetful, replaying its lesson for centuries within besieged cities, frozen winter camps, and garrison encampments. Yet the earth is a forgiving teacher. Sieges end, winters fade, and armies eventually reach lands where fresh food can be found. The antidote always lay beyond the horizon, in the next valley, in the approaching spring. Though cruel, this affliction had its limits. It had yet to find all, and without spring, without valleys, without a horizon, it had not reached the sea. And, upon this merciless, barren expanse, the ancient plague established a truly terrifying kingdom. The dawn of the age of exploration in the late 15th century was an era of human ambition. New vessels like caravels and car racks emerged, those sturdy, deep-hulled frames capable of withstanding the Atlantic's most treacherous waves. Novel navigational tools, such as astrolabes and quadrants, allowed sailors to venture confidently far from land. Mankind stood poised to draw the final borders upon the world map, yet within their meticulous planning of winds, currents, and celestial charts, they overlooked one crucial variable. They knew how to build vessels to withstand the sea, but not how to forge men who could endure it. The prolonged conditions of the voyage created an unprecedented breeding ground for scurvy to run rampant. Ships became floating besieged cities for months or even years, crew utterly cut off from land, to endure the unknown voyage. The provisions carried were inevitably a deadly diet. They had to be durable, resistant to decay, and withstand pests and damp. The staple foods aboard were hard biscuits baked months earlier, salted beef and pork cured to near inedibility, and dried peas for sustenance. Onboard water was stored in wooden barrels, while the salted beef and pork hanging from the ship's sides were so saturated with brine they were scarcely edible. The dried peas used for drinking water had to be soaked before consumption. The staple fare at sea comprised rock-hard biscuits, stale bread baked months prior, alongside barrels of salted meats. The beef and pork, saturated in brine, were scarcely edible, while dried peas served as a substitute beverage. Freshwater stored in wooden barrels soon turned viscous and foul, smelling, while copious quantities of beer or wine, though longer, lasting, offered no nutritional value. This diet entirely lacked the mysterious elements essential for sustaining bodily functions. In 1497, Vasco da Gama set sail from Lisbon seeking a sea route to India. Though this voyage achieved a maritime triumph, it proved a catastrophe for human health, for small vessels laboriously traversed the African coastline, rounding the Cape of Good Hope, a feat unprecedented in history. Yet as the fleet entered the vast, desolate expanse of the Indian Ocean, an ancient scourge began its ravages. Sailors grew listless, their gums swelled, their legs ached, and they fell one after another. Their corpses were sewn into canvas hammocks, finally fastened with the cruel practice of nose-pegging, a brutal tradition to confirm the death of these sailors, who had set sail dreaming of spices and gold. Only 50 returned to Portugal. This brutal practice served to confirm death before the bodies were cast into the sea. Of the sailors who set sail with Vasco da Gama, dreaming of spices and gold, only 50 returned to Portugal. Over 2-thirds of the crew were swallowed by the sea, not by drowning or violence, but by the silent corrosion of their internal organs. Though this voyage brought success to the Portuguese crown, it also revealed the true cost of oceanic exploration. Scurvy, this mysterious maritime plague, declared itself a primary obstacle to imperial expansion. Yet the lesson went unheeded. The law of discovery proved too potent. The great voyages continued, with Scurvy remaining the silent, unregistered passenger on every journey. The most vivid testament came from the first circumnavigation, Ferdinand Magellan's expedition of 1519. This was humanity's boldest voyage into absolute unknown territory. After traversing the perilous strait named after him at the southern tip of South America, Magellan's fleet entered a vast, tranquil ocean he christened the Pacific. To the crew, the name was absurd. This tranquil expanse was a blue desert, a liquid prison, for 90-9 days. No land appeared on the horizon. The expedition's chronicler, the Italian nobleman Antonio Pigafetta, recorded this nightmare with clinical precision. His account was not of thrilling adventure, but of slow, brutal decay. He wrote, "We ate biscuits, but they were no longer biscuits. They were powder riddled with worms, which did not away all substance, leaving a stench like rat urine." He continued, "We drank foul, yellow seawater, gnawed on the leather beneath the mainmast, and even swallowed sawdust from the planks. Rats fetched half a ducat apiece, while starvation and scurvy began systematically reaping live." Pigafetta described the symptoms with chilling precision. The most profound suffering came from the gums, which swelled to completely cover the teeth, rendering the afflicted unable to eat. He witnessed 19 men succumb in succession, their bodies wasting away, while limbs swelled to monstrous proportions. Further 30 were to ill to mend the ship, transforming the vessel into a floating hospital. Then, a floating coffin. The healthy were forced to step over corpses and the dying to perform their duties. The scale of casualties was staggering. Of the roughly 270 who set sail with Magellan, only 18 completed the circumnavigation, returning to Spain 3 years later aboard the sole surviving vessel, the Victoria. Magellan himself did not. He was killed in the Philippines. Yet the plague that crossed the Pacific with him claimed more lives among the crew than any enemy spear. At last, the world understood the deadliest killer at sea was not storm, shipwrecks, pirates, a war, but common, insidious diseases born from food barrels. Over the following 3 centuries, the age of sail, scurvy is estimated to have claimed the lives of over 2 million sailors. Every voyage of trade, exploration, and conquest exacted a mortal toll. It dictated a ship's route selection, duration at sea, and the crew's chances of returning home. When admirals planned campaigns, they had to anticipate losing half their forces to disease before a single cannonball was fired. This affliction conquered the oceans, holding nations' ambitions hostage, as its invisible force ravaged unchecked. For the sailors aboard, what was it like to endure this maritime plague? It did not strike like the sudden, feverish onslaught of malaria, but rather a slow, silent self-minus dissolution, the body being dismantled without a sound. The initial symptoms were so subtle, they were often mistaken for ordinary fatigue, merely a deep weariness, a heavy exhaustion seeping into the marrow. Sailors whose livelihood depended on physical labor found themselves unable even to haul themselves up the rigging. Muscles throbbed with a persistent, dull ache, like an injury that would never truly heal. An insatiable thirst for rest took hold, yet no amount of sleep could quench the weariness. This exhaustion was not merely physical, it was a draining of the spirit, a heavy sorrow that stained the endless voyage. A persistent dull ache clings to him, like an injury that will never heal. He sinks into a hunger-like weariness that no rest can ease. This exhaustion is not merely physical, but a draining of the spirit, where heavy sorrow stains the boundless azure sea with grey despair. It is the whisper of illness emerging, the silent sign that the body's core reserves were depleted. Then clearer signs began to appear. Finer red or purple specks emerged upon his skin, no larger than pinpricks, covering his legs and arms. These were petechiae, tiny pinpoint hemigraphs where capillaries had ruptured. When the capillaries grew fragile and began to disintegrate. The body lost its capacity for self-sustainment. Soon more severe bruising appeared, with deep, ugly stains often unsurfacing around joints. A light bump against a cannon barrel or wooden crate could trigger large bruises that would not fade for weeks. The skin itself seemed to lose its resilience, becoming dry, coarse, and flaking off in scales. The sailor's body grows increasingly fragile and brittle, ill-minus suited to the harsh conditions aboard ship. Yet the most horrifying symptoms manifest within the male. Initially, the gums become sensitive and swollen, the tissue a vivid purplish-red, glossy and puffy. To the touch, they feel spongy and soft, bleeding at the slightest pressure from a hard biscuit. As the condition worsened, the swelling became grotesquely deformed. Gums engulfed teeth, burying them within decaying, fungal-like tissue. The patient's breath emitted a suffocating stench, the air of rotten decay permeating the cramped, stifling confines of the lower decks. This was the hallmark odor of scurvy, the distinctive mark of a long voyage. As diseased gums eroded the foundations of teeth, they gradually loosened in their sockets. Sailors could feel the teeth shifting with a distinct clicking sound when speaking, until they finally fell out intact, some landing in cupped hands, others sinking into bowls of thin gruel. In the age of sail, many sailors were toothless by 30, yet the most uncanny and unsettling symptom was the recurrence of old wounds. It turned out healing was not permanent. The body required a constant supply of some unknown nutrient to sustain repair. Deprived of this substance, the body forgot how to remain whole. A scar from a tavern brawl years ago, long since healed into a pale, thin line, began to throb faintly. Gradually, it darkened to a purplish bruise, softened and swelled, until the scar tissue dissolved and the wound reopened, dripping with blood as if freshly inflicted. A leg healed to decades prior would suddenly fracture anew. As the man walked the deck, bones would snap without warning. The spectacle was horrifying, like a biological spectre haunting him, revealing the body not as a stable, solid entity, but the fragile, temporary structure liable to disintegrate into fragments at any moment. A man was literally falling apart, his personal history of trauma replaying itself upon his flesh. As the body disintegrated, consciousness often dissolved with it. The initial lethargy, he gradually sank into an abyssal paralytic depression. Men lay in hammock, staring blankly at the deck beams above, too weak and despairing to move. They keenly perceive their own slow decay, witnessing comrades succumb to illness while knowing the same fate unfolds within themselves. No enemy to fight, no storm to weather, only waiting. Limbs swell with fluid accumulation, joints creak. In the final stages, they may suddenly experience massive hemorrhages in the nasal cavity, stomach, or brain, granting a merciful swift death. Others would gradually waste away, muscles at refying, until the heart, that muscular organ, ceased beating from exhaustion. Sailors did not die of scurvy, it dismantled them piece by piece, while the ship sailed on beneath a beautiful, indifferent sky. It was a living death, the slow disintegration of bodily integrity over months in the vast ocean center, amidst the boundless expanse of the open sea. Within the silent creaking world of this wooden vessel, every sound was familiar. A groaning of beams, the crackling of canvas, the ocean's eternal sigh. Yet there existed a silent enemy, one that did not announce its arrival with cannon fire or the shattering of masts, but boarded the ship unnoticed. This foul-smelling passenger arrived with each crew, its presence sensed, yet unrecognized before science gave it name and cause. Scurvy was a spectre, a curse, its true form veiled by the thick fog of human misunderstanding. 4 generations, wise men both at sea and ashore, gazed into this mist, seeing not mere deficiency, but phantoms of their own making. The most common apparition was the ancient dread of miasma. The very word itself hung heavy and damp in the air, like the musty stench of a ship's hold during a long voyage. The air beneath the decks became a living thing, coalescing into a thick, palpable broth of foul odors. The sweat minus, soaked stench of unwashed bodies crammed into hammocks. The musty breath of 100 sleeping sailors. The rot of forgotten provisions. The damp seeping into the ship's timbers. And of course the putrid stink rising from the churning bilge water within the ship's belly. For sailors and officers alike, the notion that disease sprang from such air was utterly natural. They firmly believed illness to be poison carried on the wind, a punishment for breathing. The bilge water churning in the ship's belly reeked of sulfur. For sailors and officers alike, the notion that disease sprang from such air was inevitable. They held firm that illness was poison carried on the wind, punishment for inhaling foul vapors. Thus they fought this invisible foe with dramatic, yet futile remedies, burning tar to purify the air with acrid smoke, splashing vinegar in hopes its pungent scent would disinfect. Most dramatically, they would detonate gunpowder between decks, a ritual known as cannonading, using deafening explosions and columns of sulfur-house smoke to dispel miasmas. Sailors choked and coughed, tears streaming down their faces, while officers nodded with satisfaction. The air was purified, yet Scurvy paid no heed to the clamor of smoke, unconcerned with their quality. It lurked within the food. If the air was blameless, the fault lay squarely with the sailors themselves, within the rigid hierarchies of the Royal Navy or the Spanish Armada. The most convenient scapegoats were invariably those at the bottom of the ladder. It was said that laziness was the true root cause. Moral decay and spiritual rot would inevitably manifest as physical decay. Senior officers and admiralty officials, comfortably ensconced in well-minus appointed cabins or London offices, routinely denounced the common sailor's sloth with authoritative tones. They observed the initial fatigue, that soul minus crushing weariness, and dismissed it as lax discipline rather than illness. Sailors unable to haul ropes or climb rigging were deemed not sick but shirking duty. Their weakness was interpreted as deliberate choice, creating a vicious circular logic. Scurvy rendered them too weak to work, yet their inability to work was blamed as the cause of scurvy. Thus the cure was not medicine but discipline. More labor, more lashes. The 9 lashes word aimed a remedy to stimulate blood flow, though in truth, circulation had already faltered due to chemical imbalance. This theory was brutally convenient. It absolved rulers of responsibility for sailors' diets and living conditions. The issue lay not in salted pork and hard biscuits, but in the flawed character of those being fed. Then there was the sea itself. For centuries, sailors and the ocean maintained a complex relationship. It was their livelihood, their home, their path to riches, yet also a vast, alien, hostile environment. This environment might be poisoning them. Thus flourished the theory of seawater poisoning men surrounded by undrinkable water. Their thirst was relentless as the lash their sustenance preserved solely by salt, corned beef, salt pork, salted fish. Perhaps it was believed that this dual salting, both internal and external, was corrupting their bodies, rendering their blood excessively salty and viscous. This gave rise to an almost pathological craving for fresh water. Captains would replenish their barrels at any island shore at any cost, while inventors devoted themselves to crafting seawater distillers. These contraptions of copper pipes and furnaces were complex, costly, and inefficient, yet regarded as potential panaceas if salt water was poison. Pure fresh water must surely be the antidote. Sailors fell ill and died even after receiving carefully rationed fresh water, while the true cure grew silently along the very shores where they desperately sought it. Unnoticed among the wild grasses, the most bizarre and profoundly damaging misconception was the conflation of scurvy with venereal disease. This association seems inconceivable to modern minds, yet in the 18th century it held a terrifying plausibility. Syphilis, known as the Great Pox, ravaged the globe. Its late-stage symptoms, horrifying late-stage scurvy, was equally grotesque. patients' gums would swell and blacken, transforming into blood-soaked spongy tissue that buried the teeth. Hideous dark ulcers and bizarre bruise-like patterns would erupt upon the skin. Old wounds, even childhood scars, might suddenly reopen and fester, as if freshly inflicted. Joints swelled, while deep within the bones a persistent, dull ache lingered. For physicians of the time who witnessed sailors wasting away under these symptoms, diagnosing malignant syphilis was not entirely unreasonable. After all, sailors were the quintessential image of debauchery in foreign ports, fitting perfectly with societal perceptions. This misdiagnosis proved disastrous. Sailors who should have received treatment were instead treated as morally corrupt. The prescribed remedy for syphilis at the time was mercury, a highly toxic substance. Patients already near collapse from malnutrition were subjected to a treatment that caused excessive salivation and loosening and loss of teeth. These symptoms bore a striking resemblance to scurvy itself, compounded by violent tremors and agonizing torment. They were being poisoned to death, treated for a disease that did not exist, while the true affliction silently continued to erode their lives. This fog of misinformation was far from an academic error. It claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. Countless individuals were misled to their deaths, convinced their ailments stemmed from foul air, weak will, or moral corruption, forever unaware that the cure was as simple and unassuming as a fruit. Yet even in the thickest fog, a glimmer of light occasionally pierces through, however fleeting. Long before scientists and naval surgeons began tallying casualties, serendipitous discoveries emerged when syphilis treatments were discovered and tragically forgotten. Those fleeting moments of hope, instants devoid of scientific rigor, forced improvisation, listening to unfamiliar wisdom, pure reliance on chance, dotted this history like isolated islands of salvation in the vast seas of the age of exploration. These were not moments of rigorous science, but improvised salvation born of desperation, heeding revelations from unfamiliar wisdom, pure chance, like islands of redemption. They dotted the vast sea of suffering that was the age of exploration. One of the most astonishing instances of this forgotten remedy occurred during the harsh Canadian winter of 1535. French explorer Jacques Cartier led 3 small vessels upriver along the Strait Lawrence, establishing camp near the Iroquois village of Stade, CLA present-day Quebec City. He armed his crew intended to winter there, confident in their European constitution, but did not anticipate the river freezing over and trapping their vessels. The ice, several feet thick, clamped down like a vice, while snow piled up into sheer walls. The crew were confined to their cabins, surviving on dwindling rations of salted meat and hardtack. The Frenchmen gradually fell ill, the disease spreading silently at first, a creeping lethargy, the dull ache in the legs, followed by the dreadful transformation: swollen, festering gums, teeth falling out, limbs swelling and discoloring. By February 1536, nearly all 110 men under Cartier's command were gravely ill, with 20-5 already dead. The devout Cartier organized religious processions, beseeching a miracle. The miracle did not come from divine revelation, but from the inhabitants of this land, the Stade AC on a people, witnessing the unfamiliar visitors suffer from ailments they knew well. They were moved by compassion. Cartier noticed an Iroquois man named Dreamy, who had previously been sickly but now suddenly appeared healthy and energetic. Upon inquiry, Dreamy had described a remedy, a decoction brewed from the leaves and bark of specific evergreen trees, locally termed and with no other recourse. The desperate Frenchmen gathered branches like the eastern white cedar or pine as instructed and simmered them in large pots. Though the brew tasted bitter and strange, they persevered, even applying the boiled leaves to their swollen limbs. Cartier himself described the effect as miraculous. Within days, the men began to recover. Skin ulcers gradually subsided, joint swelling receded, and decayed gum tissue started to heal. The speed and thoroughness of their recovery seemed almost magical. They had discovered a life-saving remedy. The indigen of herbal medicine had saved them. Yet tragedy lay in the fact that although Cartier meticulously documented the tree species, preparation methods, and astonishing efficacy in his logbook, this invaluable written record vanished entirely upon his return to France. Relegated to the realm of curious anecdotes rather than medical breakthrough, European physicians, entrenched in classical humoral theory and miasma doctrine, dismissed it as barbarian superstition, unable even to identify the specific species of and re. This knowledge laid dormant for 2 centuries. Countless European sailors would perish from the very diseases Cartier's crew had overcome amidst Canada's glacial waters. The remedy had been discovered, yet carelessly discarded. A glimmer of hope was swallowed by the mists once more. This was not an isolated incident. In the 1592, Sir Richard Hawkins, an experienced English naval commander, recorded in his memoirs that during voyages he had personally witnessed the curative effect of limes and lemons on the affliction. Asserting their efficacy was beyond doubt. Yet this observation became buried amidst the vast details of naval and shipboard life, remaining a personal observation rather than official policy. Without research to validate it, it ultimately became merely an anecdote in maritime lore. Pragmatic Dutch sailors, however, adopted a more systematic approach. Though driven by logistical rather than medical considerations, they established vegetable gardens or remote islands, such as Street Helena in the South Atlantic. A strategic decision fleets bound for the East Indies could replenish with fresh vegetables and fresh water. This supply station proved remarkably effective, with sailors docking at Street Helena suffering far fewer cases of scurvy than those who did not. They understood that fresh food sustained seafarers' lives, yet failed to grasp the precise mechanism, neither attributing the cure to specific nutrients nor recognizing it as a universal benefit beyond monotonous sea rations. Should vessels stray off course and miss the supply island, crews would still languish and perish. Hope rested upon some isolated islet marked on a map, not upon a universal principle that could be carried aboard. These fortuitous remedies and fleeting hopes drifted like messages in bottles upon the currents of history. Most never reach shore. Those few washed ashore are glanced at hurriedly before being discarded. Knowledge remains fragmented, preserved only in anecdotes, forever at odds with the entrenched medical theories of the time. To the authorities, the answer seemed too simple, too mundane. Could such profound and terrifying diseases truly be defeated by commonplace items like lemons or leaves? The solution must surely be more complex, more scholarly. So the warships sailed on. Sailors continued to fall, awaiting the arrival of a hero, not one wielding a sword, but one wielding the scientific method. He would not merely stumble upon a cure, but prove its efficacy with irrefutable evidence in the most improbable of laboratories. That floating laboratory aboard the wooden decks of a British warship, the turning point, the moment when the fog of misinformation finally began to lift, did not occur in grand universities or royal physicians' chambers, but aboard a British warship patrolling the English Channel, within its cramped, damp, and swaying confines. The year was 1747. The vessel was the HMS Salisbury, a fourth-rate ship of the line armed with 50 guns. On board was a quiet, perceptive, and compassionate Scotsman named James Lind. As the ship's surgeon, he witnessed firsthand the slow torment of scurvy, countless sturdy sailors wasting away as the disease consumed them, their eyes sunken like skeletons, their bodies decaying while their minds remained unnaturally lucid. He had tried every traditional remedy, vinegar, potions, purgatives, yet witnessed all fail. But Lind was no ordinary practitioner. He was also a scholar. He had studied historical texts, including Cartier's tales of miracles and Hawkins's observations, and knew of dozens of conflicting theories, yet was appalled that none were backed by substantive evidence. He concluded conjecture was wholly insufficient. The time for experimentation had come. In May 1747, after 10 weeks at sea, the crew of the Salisbury began exhibiting familiar signs of scurvy. The sailors grew increasingly fatigued. Their gums began to swell. Len knew the condition would only worsen. He saw an opportunity not merely to cure the disease, but to explore truth. His experimental design was so simple, elegant, and novel that it is now recognized as one of the first controlled clinical trials in medical history. He first selected 12 sailors with similar levels of scurvy symptom, meticulously documenting them in his notes with the rigor of a clinician. Gum ulcers, legs covered in patches and swellings, to ensure fair comparison. All were housed in the same forward cabin section and maintained on identical baseline ration. A nigrate diet of watery gruel, sugar cubes, and mutton broth. After establishing this baseline, he divided the 12 into 6 groups. Each continued the standard diet, but received additional supplements of different preparations, representing one of several proposed therapies at the time. This meticulously designed controlled trial aimed to isolate key variables and reveal truly effective treatments. The first pair consumed a quart of cidered ale, while the second group substituted grape juice. This rigorous controlled trial sought to isolate single factors potentially influencing outcomes. The first pair drank a quart of cidered ale, a beverage favored by sailors, whose fermented apple base was believed to possess therapeutic properties. The second group took 20-5 drops of Epsom salts modern sulfate thrice daily, a therapy then favored by physicians who believed that strong acidity would string bodily tissue. The third group received 2 spoonfuls of vinegar 3 times daily. This was another common acid therapy, intended to counteract the so called bodily putrefaction caused by disease. The fourth group drank half a pint of seawater daily, based on the principle of purging toxins from the body. The fifth group applied an ointment made from herbs including garlic, mustard seed, and myrrh, a complex concoction from the traditional apothecary. Finally, the 2 men in the 6th group received a simple prescription, 2 oranges and 1 lemon ale. The experiment commenced on the 20th of May. During the initial days, Lind closely observed the patients and meticulously recorded his finding. The seawater group's condition continued to deteriorate. The sulfuric and acetic acid group complained of the foul taste, yet showed no improvement. The apple cider vinegar group reported feeling slightly more comfortable and having a little more energy, but their physical symptoms remained unchanged. The sailors taking the ointment suffered terribly, yet the 6th group experienced a remarkable turnaround. The 2 men consuming citrus fruits, specifically oranges and lemons, began to improve at an astonishing rate. Within just 6 days of the citrus therapy, one had fully recovered and was deemed fit for duty. The other had improved sufficiently to care for 10 patients. The experiment's results were indisputable, immediate, and profoundly effective. Lind's conclusion was as clear as the summer sky, yet the experiment ended when the ship's supply of fresh fruit was exhausted. Though he had proven his thesis, Lind could not continue this remarkably effective treatment. This starkly highlighted the logistical challenges of sustaining such a regimen. Yet the evidence was undeniable. While the remaining 10 sailors either deteriorated or showed no improvement, the 2 who had consumed citrus fruits were essentially cured. Lind not only cured the sailors, but by systematically eliminating ineffective treatments through simultaneous comparison under identical conditions, precisely identified the truly effective remedy. This was the application of scientific method with astonishing simplicity in the harshest of environments. Yet James Lind's story contains a suffocating irony. He held the cure, he held the evidence. In 1753, 6 years after concluding his experiments, he published his detailed findings in a treatise on scurvy. Yet for nearly half a century thereafter, nothing changed. The Royal Navy, the world's largest and most powerful organization at the time, failed to adopt his recommendations. Ships continued sailing laden with vinegar and potassium sulfate, and sailors continued dying by the thousands, continued to perish by the thousands. The root of this delay lay in a perfect storm of human error and institutional inertia. The Admiralty, a vast conservative bureaucracy, resisted change while harboring systems towards the humble ships. Surgeons' novel ideas, oranges and lemons, were prohibitively expensive, especially compared to cheap cider or vinegar, and worse still, they spoiled all too readily. Who could stockpile sufficient fresh fruit for a 3-year voyage? Ironically, Lind himself inadvertently undermined this remarkable discovery in his treatise. He buried the experiments deep within 400 pages of abstruse academic discourse. Rather than placing them at the heart of his argument, he devoted equal space and consideration to all erroneous theories of disease, demonstrating scholarly rigor, yet obscuring his central argument. More fatally, he proposed a well-intentioned solution to fruit preservation, boiling citrus juice into a concentrated syrup. This seemingly reasonable long-term storage method failed to anticipate that high temperatures would destroy the crucial component enabling the juice's efficacy. That fragile, then unknown molecule we now call vitamin C. Over the following decade, the Navy repeatedly tested this boiled effectless syrup, finding no results. They concluded Lind's citrus therapy was ineffective. The truth lay starkly evident on the deck of the HMS Salisbury, yet vanished swiftly after publication into a fog of miscommunication, bureaucratic inertia, and chemical misjudgment. The era of scientific evidence had dawned, but the age of its practical application remained distant. One might imagine James Lind's 1753 treatise on scurvy causing a sensation within the wood-panelled offices of the British Admiralty, picturing wigged commissioners poring over its pages beneath London's grey light streaming through high windows, promptly ordering lemon supplies for the entire fleet. Yet this remains a fantasy of a world driven by logic and deficiency. The real world, particularly the bureaucracy of the 18th century, remained enslaved to the comfortable inertia of convention, economy, and established thought. Thus Lindesay's elegant proof, his meticulously documented experiments aboard the HMS Salisbury, made no such sensation. Instead, it was set aside with the quiet thud of a book placed upon a crowded shelf in the vast library of ideas. There it would gather dust for nearly half a century, 40-2 years of silence. To be precise, this silence was measured not in time, but in the slow, agonizing deaths of thousands of sailors. Thousands of sailors' slow, agonizing deaths. The cause of this deadly stagnation was not simple, but a complex web woven from the stubbornness of institutions, economic realities, and the very nature of scientific progress. To comprehend the Admiralty's indifference, one must first grasp the Admiralty itself, not a singular entity, but a complex, fragmented organism. The First Lord of the Admiralty set strategy, the Board of the Admiralty built ships, the Board of the Quartermaster General, housed at Somerset House, managed ship provisions, while the Board of Sickness and Injury, this body of physicians, oversaw the sailors' health. To implement Lind's discovery, every cog in this vast naval machinery had to turn in unison, and citrus procurement required medical approval, was deemed affordable by the Board of Supply, and finally commended by the First Lord. Friction in any single gear could, undid, bring the entire process to a grinding halt. The physicians of the Sickness Board were men of profound learning, graduates of Edinburgh and London universities, steeped in classical medical systems like humoral theory and miasma doctrine. Lindesay's assertion that common fruit cures systemic dreadful diseases appeared to them as crude folk wisdom, scarcely worthy of a snare, more akin to alchemy than anatomy. At that time, Science was advancing into astonishingly complex realm, with new theories on chemistry, gases, acids and alkalis, and the very essence of life emerging in rapid succession. They believed that plagues must have complex causes, requiring equally sophisticated remedies, attributing disease to grand mechanism, some form of internal decay, clearly aligned better with intellectual pursuits. The theory of putrefaction gained particular traction. Foul air in ship holds, persistent damp conditions, and indigestible salted beef diets were said to cause bodily tissues to rot from within. Consequently, the cure must be a bactericide capable of halting this decay. Thus, the remedies recommended by the Board of Sick and Wounded sounded far more scientific than mere oranges. They advocated an alcoholic solution of potassium and sodium sulfate, i.e., sulfuric acid. This potent, intensely stimulating, and undeniably chemical minus-based solution, though utterly ineffective against scurvy, exuded an air of authority. Yet Irish physician David McBride's research proved more persuasive, proposing a remedy both logical and remarkably convenient. McBride posited that scurvy stemmed from the loss of fixed air, now termed carbon dioxide, from human tissue. He asserted that fermentation could restore this vital gas, proposing malt liquor as his remedy. The sweet, unfermented beer, brewed from barley malt steeped in hot water, proved easily producible aboard ships. Its ingredients were readily available from the Board of War Supplies, extensive stockpiles, and possessed a distinctly British character. Malt liquor was inexpensive, widely known, and perfectly suited to the existing naval supply chain, the most effortless solution imaginable. McBride's work met with great success, and the Admiralty, ever eager for economical solutions, ordered large minor-scale trials of malt extract. The results, however, were ambiguous, as is often the case with placebos and half-minus measures. Some captains reported slight improvements, while others detected no change whatsoever. Yet this ambiguity was sufficient to generate clamor and confusion, drowning the clear signals from Lynn's experiments in a sea of contradictory data and more palatable theories. More ruthlessly, the logic of cost proved unassailable. 18th-century citrus fruits were luxury items, sought from nations like Spain and Italy that were frequently at war with Britain. Securing these fruits demanded intricate international supply chains and proved highly perishable. Providing regular citrus juice rations for the entire Royal Navy would prove prohibitively expensive. The Board of Supply, tasked with feeding hundreds of thousands of sailors on tight budgets, recoiled at the prospect they could furnish a gallon of beer for pennies, yet could not guarantee a steady supply of a single crate of lemons. The cost of a crate of lemons fluctuated wildly, and its availability was equally uncertain. Naval accountants and London officers could make cold calculations. The price of 1,000 lemons compared to the replacement cost of 10 to 20 sailors who might perish on a single voyage. In an era of rampant recruitment drives and high unemployment, sailors were, after all, pitifully replaceable cogs. Citrus fruits were different. They clung to their familiar rations of beer and hard biscuits, occasionally supplemented with useless sulfuric acid. Lynn himself was a modest, unassuming man, not a cunning politician. He did not lobby vigorously within the Admiralty in his later writings. He even discussed alternative therapies, including malt extract, thereby downplaying the unique value of his own discovery. The antidote was printed in black and white, yet the system remained unprepared to accept it. Those in power were not villains, they were merely shackled by the constraints of their era, the snares of financial conservatism, flawed scientific paradigms, and a bureaucracy that obstructed rather than embraced change. The cost of this resistance was paid in blood and gore, in the silent despair of countless sailors' rotting gums, withered limbs, all for lack of that simple sour fruit. While London's medical establishment and the Royal Navy's command clung to theory and tradition, a man of extraordinary practical genius, was preparing to rewrite the rules of ocean navigation. This man was not a physician but a navigator, a Yorkshire farm boy who rewrote the world map with near-minus obsessive attention to detail. His name was Captain James Cook. When Cook took command of the Endeavour in 1768, secret orders directed him to sail to the South Pacific to observe the transit of Venus, and subsequently to explore the uncharted southern continent. This voyage was widely regarded as a death sentence for the crew. 2 or 3 years afloat, far from friendly ports, meant scurvy was not a risk but an inevitability. But Cook was no ordinary commander. He viewed his men's health not as fate, but as a logistical problem to be solved with the same meticulous rigor as charting uncharted coastlines. He did not expect a miracle cure to vanquish scurvy. He did not believe in such things. He would defeat it through a comprehensive, systematic offensive, relying on discipline to overcome it. Cook's strategy was holistic, beginning not with medicine, but with cleanliness. 18th-century warships were filthy, overcrowded, and damp, breeding grounds for disease. Cook declared war on filth, demanding unprecedented standards of cleanliness within the Navy. The lower decks where sailors live, including those with hammocks, were to be constantly scraped and dared on fair days. Crew bedding and clothing were hauled onto the deck to bask in the sun, while coal-fired braziers were used to dispel dampness within the holds. The entire vessel was periodically fumigated with gunpowder, while the wooden hull was scrubbed with vinegar-water. This near-obsessive cleanliness had profound consequences. It drastically reduced common ailments like typhus and dysentery, which often left sailors weakened and vulnerable to scurvy, sometimes killing them before severe illness could take hold. Cook believed a healthier crew meant greater resistance to disease. His second line of defense was diet. This relentless experimenter was willing to try any method that might ward off illness. Adopting Dr. McBride's theory, the Admiralty stocked his ships with 70-5 bushels of malt for brewing malt liquor. Cook dutifully brewed and enforced its consumption, noting in his log, though not the ultimate remedy, it proved remarkably effective. The Admiralty also supplied orange-lemon syrup, a thick, concentrated syrup boiled for hours, now known to be worthless. The prolonged boiling process destroyed nearly all the vitamin C in the transportable syrup. Ironically, Cook's mixed results with his concoction were later cited as evidence questioning citrus efficacy, further complicating the matter. Yet Cook's most renowned provision was sauerkraut. He carried nearly 8,000 pounds of it, on the advice of German physicians who had observed Dutch sailors consuming sauerkraut regularly suffered less scurvy, persuading skeptical British sailors to consume what they deemed foul, smelling. Slimy German pickled cabbage proved a common challenge. Cook avoided direct orders risking mutiny and instead employed psychological ingenuity. He prepared and served sauerkraut daily, but exclusively at his own table, for officers in the main cabin, without explanation or command. He simply allowed the crew to observe the captain and gentlemen enjoying it with evident relish. As he foresaw, human nature took its course. The sailors concluded that a dish reserved for officers must be delicious, and soon began demanding their own portions. Within a week, sauerkraut had become so popular throughout the ship that he had to introduce rationing. Sauerkraut does indeed preserve a small amount of vitamin C during fermentation, though not a miracle cure. As a preventative measure, its sustained consumption over months became a crucial piece of the puzzle, raising the baseline of health by a small yet vital margin. The true essence of Cook's method, and the fundamental reason why scurvy afflicted only a handful of his crew across 3 epic voyages, lay in his relentless pursuit of fresh provisions at every opportunity. To Cook, coastlines were not mere lines on a map, but potential pantries at every landing, however remote the location or fleeting the stay. Dispatching parties ashore to forage became paramount. at Tierra del Fuego, the frozen tip of South America. Sailors, guided by expedition naturalist Joseph Banks, gathered vast quantities of wild celery and a plant the locals called scurvy grass. In the tropical paradise of Tahiti, they traded provisions for breadfruit, bananas and coconuts in New Zealand. They learned from the Maori to gather wild spinach. Cook compelled his men to boil these leafy greens into soup for consumption, showing no leniency. When 2 sailors refused to eat the fresh produce, he ordered them flogged as punishment. He wrote, "No one can question that I have done everything possible to safeguard the crew's health." It was precisely this systematic approach to securing vitamin C from natural sources that prevented scurvy from ever causing catastrophic consequences among the fleet. In 1771, Cook returned to England after his first circumnavigation, having sailed for nearly 3 years without a single death from scurvy. This achievement was so astonishing it faced skepticism. On his second voyage, he ventured even further into the Antarctic Circle, yet only one of over 100 crew members succumbed to the disease. The evidence was irrefutable. Cook demonstrated that scurvy was not an inevitable fate of ocean voyages, but a conquerable foe. Hailed as a hero, he received the Royal Society's prestigious Copley Medal for his paper on preserving sailors' health, rather than his cartographic achievements. Yet, in the ultimate irony of fate, Cook's success actually delayed the final revelation. His comprehensive system, clean environments, sauerkraut, malt, foraging strategies, proved effective. Yet his seminal paper failed to pinpoint the crucial factor, while crediting all methods. He particularly championed the Navy Board's preferred malted drink therapy. He declared citrus fruit virtually useless, though he wrought miracles in practical health management. His failure to grasp precise scientific principles steered the medical world in entirely erroneous directions. He showed them the promised land, yet handed them a faulty map to reach it. The final piece of the puzzle was not assembled by navigators on the open sea, but by a physician equally versed in the halls of power and the wards of naval hospitals. The impetus for change lay not in voyages of discovery, but in a struggle for national survival. As the bloody 18th century drew to a close, Britain found itself embroiled in a colossal conflict with revolutionary France, and later Napoleonic France. This was warfare of a new kind, total war, whose decisive theatre was the boundless ocean. The Royal Navy's grand design hinged upon the sustained surveillance of French ports, the so-minus cold strategy of coastal blockade. Fleets commanded by Cornwallis and Nelson were required to maintain prolonged stations offshore at ports such as Brest and Toulon, sometimes for months or even years, enduring the harshest winter gales and the most scorching summers. This presented unprecedented challenges to supply lines and the limits of human endurance. Yet the greatest threat to this strategy was not French cannonballs, but the insidious spectre of scurvy. When fleets were forced to return to port with crews stricken and weakened, enemy vessels could sail freely. Blockading fleets risked becoming utterly paralyzed within months. Scurvy had transcended medical concerns to become a fatal strategic vulnerability. It was within this crucible of survival that Gilbert Bligh rose to prominence. Brian was the polar opposite of James Lind, ambitious, politically astute, and well connected. Serving as fleet surgeon under Admiral Sir George Rodney during the American War of Independence, he witnessed firsthand the devastating impact of scurvy on naval operations. Entire fleets crippled, over half their crews rendered unfit for duty. He meticulously documented scurvy's crippling effects on naval operations, entire fleets paralyzed, crews unable to man the rigging. Witnessing first-hand scurvy's devastating impact on naval warfare, seeing entire fleets incapacitated, over half the crew rendered unfit for sail. Through his detailed records, he amassed a wealth of statistical evidence. As an adherent of Enlightenment thought, Brian revered data. He studied Lynn's writings. Grasping the essence of their elegant simplicity, he examined Cook's voyage journals while discerning the navigator's own errors. Noting that though sauerkraut and malted drinks might offer some benefit, the sole consistent factor in Cook's successes was the relentless pursuit of fresh vegetables. He ultimately concluded Lindisfarne had been right all along. Citrus was the cure. Armed with data and conviction, Brian waged an unrelenting campaign. He leveraged his social connections to sway key naval officers and politicians, securing appointment to the Board of Sickness and Injury, the very institution that had ignored Lindisfarne for decades, and began driving change from within. He offered papers and submitted evidence. He abandoned medical jargon, instead framing his case in the language of military logistics and national security. The cost of lemons was negligible compared to a crippled fleet, defeat, or a French invasion. He highlighted the enormous expenditure at naval hospitals in Portsmouth and Plymouth, some years treating over 10,000 scurvy patients, sailors who should have been serving but were instead confined to hospital wards. He emphasized that supplying lemon juice was not an expense but an investment, one that enhanced naval combat effectiveness with a potency comparable to a brand minus new 100- gun battleship. The turning point came in 1794. The Admiralty was finally persuaded by Brian's irrefutable logic and authorized a decisive trial. The battleship, HMS Suffolk, bound for India, became a mobile laboratory. Beyond standard provisions, the vessel carried substantial reserves of lemon juice preserved with a small quantity of spirits, rationed daily to each crew member. This arduous voyage, spanning 20-3 weeks and 1 day without docking, a journey that in previous years would have spelt disaster, proceeded without incident. Yet when the Suffolk arrived at Madras Harbour, the entire crew's health constituted a miracle of the age. Though isolated, mild cases of scurvy emerged early in the voyage. They were swiftly cured by the lemon juice, and not a single death occurred throughout the entire journey. The experiment achieved an undeniably monumental success, its evidence overwhelming and impossible to ignore. In 1795, faced with Gilbert Blaine's memorandum, the Admiralty ministers finally issued a historic order. The Royal Navy would henceforth dispense 3-quarters of an ounce of lemon juice daily to every seaman, to be mixed with their daily ration of grog, the indispensable minus water concoction of naval life. The effect was immediate and profound, as if a switch had been flipped. Scurvy, that ancient terror that struck dread into the hearts of deep-sea sailors, vanished almost overnight from the Royal Navy fleet. Naval hospitals stood empty, the demand for recruiters plummeted, and seasoned sailors could extend their service, their health restored. The fleet's combat capability was thus revitalized. Warships could now sail indefinitely. Without lemon juice, Nelson's fleet could never have held out for nearly 2 years off Toulon, driven the French to the West Indies, and ultimately secured the decisive victory at Trafalgar in 1805. The credit for defeating Napoleon is shared equally between the Duke of Wellington and Gilbert Blaine, along with the humble lemon. By this time, British sailors had become the most robust seafarers globally, achieving overwhelming dominance at sea that left their French and Spanish adversaries, plagued by traditional ailments, far behind. This newfound maritime health endowed them with a proud spirit, earning them a reputation for unyielding resilience, a reputation both well-deserved and enviable. It was this that later earned them their nickname. Driven by colonial economics, the Admiralty began substituting the costly Mediterranean lemon with the cheaper West Indian lime, a decision destined to have disastrous consequences. Limes, particularly the West Indian variety, contain far less vitamin C than lemons. Moreover, the juicing, processing, and storage methods often destroyed its trace vitamin content. Decades later, when British Arctic expeditions suffered a resurgence of scurvy due to this substitute. The medical community plunged once more into confusion and debate. Yet, in the age of sail, the practice had become deeply entrenched. Other navies, observing the robust physique of British sailors, sometimes derisively dubbed them lemon juice workers, or more succinctly, lemon med, a nickname born of administrative simplification and botanical error. This misnomer persisted long after the giant wooden warships vanished, becoming the final ironic echo of a protracted struggle against disease ultimately defeated by the sea itself. The great enigma of scurvy appeared solved. James Lind had pointed the way. Gilbert Blyon, the Royal Navy, made the cure official standard, transforming British sailors into the most robust crew upon the seas, the terror of the oceans. Yet knowledge is fragile. It is not a monument carved in stone, but rather a memory, one that fades, is reinterpreted, and is quietly eroded by economics and convenience. As the 19th century dawned, bringing with it a heady new faith in industrial progress, the ancient lessons began to fray at the edges. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. Scurvy merely lay dormant in the world's coldest, most unforgiving corners, biding its time, waiting to strike again. A fervent belief in industrial progress saw the old lessons begin to wear thin at the margins. The campaign may have been won, but the war was far from over. Scurvy merely lay dormant in the world's coldest, harshest corners, biding its time to return to the frozen frontier, the Arctic, there, where profound silence meets blinding whiteness. The ocean transforms into a hard, cracked continent, and sunlight becomes a fleeting memory for half the year. This final blank on the map presented an irresistible challenge to the British Navy, brimming with post-minus Napoleonic confidence and abundant fleets. For the Admiralty, that institution overflowing with Napoleonic minus, or self-minus assurance and ample warship reserve, it was undeniably an irresistible challenge. The quest for the Northwest Passage became a national obsession, prompting the dispatch of the finest vessels and bravest sailors into the ice-bound waste, equipped with the most advanced technological innovations of the era. Among these was a remarkable new invention in food: sealed tins of corned beef, mutton, and vegetable broth, promising varied and nutritionally balanced rations that could be preserved for years. This represented a logical advancement over traditional salted beef, and of course, ample supplies of the scurvy-preventing agent, lemon juice, were included. Yet within these seemingly trivial logistical details, the curtain had already silently risen on tragedy. The Admiralty, in its net-picking bureaucracy, had long since substituted the nutrient-rich, costly Mediterranean lemons in provisions for the more readily available and cheaper West Indian limes from its colonies. We now know that the protective efficacy of limes was less than half that of lemons, a significant downgrade. Worse still, the method used to preserve the juice for the long voyage involved boiling it down into a thick, dark concentrate. This process required copper vessels and high temperatures, both of which were highly effective at destroying the very fragile, intangible molecules they sought to preserve. The polar explorers consumed an antidote systematically stripped of its efficacy. They carried but a phantom, a ghostly remnant of therapeutic potency. Thus we arrive at this legendary expedition, a Victorian ghost story whispered for decades around firesides and in parliamentary inquiries. In May 1845, Sir John Franklin commanded to majestic warship, the Erebus and the Terror, as they set sail from England. These vessels, reinforced to withstand the pressure of pack ice, were equipped with steam engines and propellers, and carried provisions for 3 years. On board were 129 officers and sailors, the Royal Navy's finest. They carried over 8,000 tins of preserved meat and soups supplied by contractor Stephen Godwin. A canning process later proven hasty, slipshod, and fatally flawed. The ships also held official rations in barrels boiled, largely useless concentrated lemon juice. In late July, whalers in Bath and Bay witnessed them for the last time as they waited for the ice to break up. They then sailed west into the labyrinth of islands, vanishing from the world for years. Silence descended as the ships became trapped in the ice near King William Island, mirroring the fate of countless predecessors, but this time with no escape. We can only imagine the creeping dread. The first winter passed. The second descended. The sun vanished for months. The world became the groaning of shifting ice, the howling of gales, and the dim, cramped spaces of the ship's hold. Tinned provisions, once a source of boundless hope, now bred suspicion some had spoiled. Many were sealed with thick lead solder, the metal seeping into the food, slowly poisoning the crew, leaving them weak, confused, and despondent. And that old foe they thought defeated began to stir, first as a deep weariness, a bone minus deep fatigue the cold and darkness could not fully explain, joints aching faintly. Then the gums showed the first signs, the vibrant, healthy pink turning to a bruised, purplish swelling, teeth loosening in their sockets. Old scars, long since healed, began to reopen. In the frozen, sterile world, the body's ability to maintain its own tissues gradually failed, and scurvy raged in its purest, most terrifying form. Lead poisoning and malnutrition had already left the crew utterly debilitated, powerless against this new affliction. Their hopes rested on advanced technology, canned provisions, and the daily ration of official scurvy prevention, a belief ultimately in vain. Franklin himself succumbed to illness in June 1847. The surviving crew, led by Captain Crozier, finally departed the icebound vessels in the spring of 1848, attempting to trek south on foot towards the mainland trading post. This became a death march. Later, scattered bones were found on the island, some desperately lined up in a row heading south, others in small groups, and still others curled up in makeshift tents. The Inuit who later discovered the wreckage and corpses described bodies with blackened gums and an unearthly stench. They were all too familiar with such sights and knew precisely what they signified. The search for the Franklin expedition itself became another epic, spawning dozens of expeditions. These search parties, too, suffered from scurvy, yet some grasped a lesson Franklin's men, blinded by imperialist hubris, never understood. From the Inuit, they learned that the antidote to this desolate land lay not in plants buried beneath the snow, but in the land itself. Consuming fresh seal meat, particularly the liver and other offal rich in the nutrients they lacked, proved effective against the disease. This represented a fundamental return to practical wisdom, adopting the diet of the local healthy inhabitants. Some took this to heart, others stubbornly refused. Over half a century later, Robert Scott, on his tragic Antarctic expedition, still battled the same adversary. He dismissed the lemon juice remedy as outdated, stubbornly insisting scurvy stemmed from bacterial poisoning in poor-quality meat. Meticulous planning and scientific rigor were fatally undermined by this colossal oversight. When he and his men reached the South Pole, they discovered Roald Amundson's Norwegian flag already planted there. On the return journey, hunger, frostbite, and the undeniable crippling symptoms of scurvy claimed their lives. In contrast, Amundsen had studied Inuit survival techniques, and his crew consumed fresh seal meat and even dog meat. They reached the South Pole and returned home in full health. In the harsh, unforgiving survival rules of polar exploration, misconceptions about scurvy amounted to a death sentence. Yet this scourge was never confined to the desolation of polar ice sheets or the boundless expanse of the oceans. Scurvy was not a disease of geography, but of circumstance, a disease of isolation, a disease of entrapment, arising from any situation that severed humanity's access to a steady supply of fresh, living food. It could breed in the heart of a continent just as readily as it could breed within a ship's hold. Throughout the 19th century, as humanity ventured into new frontiers and trembled amid fresh conflicts. Scurvy remained a constant shadow, a plague upon the land. Consider the Irish famine of 1845, the very year Franklin's expedition vanished into the endless ice. This catastrophe stemmed not from exploration, but from an agricultural tragedy, an entire nation's over-reliance on a single crop, the potato. This miracle crop yielded vast quantities of calories on poor soil, yet it was also the primary source of vitamin C for millions of impoverished rural folk. Not because potatoes themselves were rich in vitamin C, but because their daily, copious consumption barely met the body's demands. When famine struck, the fungus called Phytophthora infestans swept across the island, transforming potatoes in the ground into black, inedible slime. With the staple food gone, famine followed, and in the shadow of famine lurked its sinister companion scurvy. The relief efforts organized by the British government in London proved tragically inadequate. Shackled by rigid free-minus market ideology, they supplied only cornmeal imported from the Americas, dubbed sulphur skin by the Irish. This aid was not only nutritionally deficient but, crucially, devoid of vitamin C. In the wake of the famine, its dreadful companion, scurvy, inevitably followed. The relief efforts organized by the British government in London proved tragically inadequate, constrained by rigid free-minus market economic principles. They supplied cornmeal imported from America, dubbed sulphur skin by the Irish for its yellow hue and stomach minus churning properties. While providing calories, it utterly lacked the NT-scurvy factor. Thus, among the starved populace, classic symptoms emerged: swollen, bleeding gums, joint pain, the reactivation of old injuries in deep tissues, and abnormal bone development in children. Severe subcutaneous bruising and bleeding in advanced stages earned the disease the name blackleg. Though not the famine's primary killer, scurvy accelerated mortality, joint pain, recurrence of deep tissue injuries, and skeletal deformities in children. The late stage condition, characterized by horrific subcutaneous bruising and exudation, was dubbed blackleg disease. Scurvy was not the famine's chief executioner. That grim title belonged to starvation itself, alongside typhus and cholera ravaging the crowded wards of workhouses and soup kitchens. Yet it was scurvy that undermined most physical resilience, a destroyer of vital defenses. Like an engineer, it dismantled the body's defenses, rendering other diseases more lethal. This in turn became the barren fields, a nationwide nutritional collapse stemming from a single catastrophic dependency. Half a world away, another frenzy unfolded, where scurvy likewise raged. The 1848 California gold rush saw tens of thousands of prospectors, the 40-9ers, surging into the Sierra Nevada mountains, dreaming of seizing riches from the earth. Most were young bachelors, unprepared for frontier life's harshness. Isolating them were not snow or plague, but vast distances and treacherous terrain. They camped in makeshift settlements, miles from any cultivated land. What did they eat? Only portable, non-perishable fare, salted pork, beans, and an endless supply of flour, which they bake into hard biscuits or flatbreads. Their diet resembled that of sailors on a long voyage, adrift in this sea of land. Thus scurvy became widespread among miners in the gold field. Some, though their pockets were filled with gold dust, wasted away in their tents, teeth falling out, legs covered in mottled ulcers, too weak even to lift a percasse. Correspondence and diaries of the time brim with such accounts, people recounting the profound despondency shrouding the counts, their bodies and spirits utterly spent. They blamed foul air, grueling labor, and mountain fever, scarcely knowing the true name of their affliction. Yet some understood well, where there is sickness, there is a market for cures. Merchants seized the opportunity, hauling crates of potatoes, onions, and even barrels of pickled vegetables into the mountains. peddling them at exorbitant prices, $1 for an onion, $1's worth of gold, when $1 was a day's wage. Citrus fruits were the ultimate luxury. It was said that for those in the final stages, a single lemon held the value of an equal weight in gold dust. In this primitive capitalist gold rush, the most precious treasure lay not in subterranean gold, but in the life-sustaining essence contained within common vegetables. Then the American Civil War erupted. This conflict, mobilizing the nation's entire industrial might, ironically created an industrial minor-scale breeding ground for scurvy. Supplying the vast armies of both North and South proved a logistical nightmare. Soldiers' rations devolved into a monotonous list of non-perishables: hardtack, salted beef or pork, coffee. Though the Union's vast quartermaster system grew increasingly sophisticated, often supplying troops with dried vegetables and pressed green-leaf biscuits, the supply chain inevitably fractured during long marches away from depots or protracted sieges like Vicksburg. For the Confederacy, grappling with a collapsed agricultural economy, crippled railways, and an intensifying Union blockade, the situation proved far more dire. Confederate soldiers suffered chronic malnutrition, their rations almost entirely devoid of essential nutrients. Scurvy ravaged multiple rebel units, steadily depleting manpower and morale. It haunted military hospitals like a specter, reaching its zenith at Andersonville prison camp in Georgia, where tens of thousands of Union prisoners were crammed into foul, smelling open-air-fenced camps with scant shelter and meager rations. Here, scurvy ran rampant, joining dysentery, typhoid, and ascariasis in forging a veritable hell on earth. Yet this affliction was not confined to prisoners. For ordinary soldiers, foraging on the battlefield became a vital survival skill when troops seized farm vegetable plots or orchards. They were not merely supplementing meager rations, but unknowingly treating themselves. Every turnip dug, every apple picked, every wild onion gathered served as a defense against scurvy. What military doctors termed scurvy filth was acknowledged throughout the army as a latent threat, a silent enemy capable of decimating entire legions like concentrated gunfire. By the late 19th century, scurvy remained an unsolved mystery. The evidence was compelling yet contradictory. Lemons worked, fresh vegetables worked, raw meat worked too. But why? Theories tangled like a knotted deficiency of some acidic substance, toxins from spoiled food, bacterial infection, or, as some insisted, a matter of morale and sanitation. The cure was known, yet the cause remained a black box. To truly conquer the disease and banish it from land and sea, science required new tools and new thinking. The answer would not emerge on a ship's bridge or in a miner's camp, but lay hidden within the quiet, rigorous world of the laboratory. With the dawn of a new century and the birth of the emerging science of nutrition, the final piece of the puzzle would finally fall into place, as science often does. The crucial clue emerged from an accident in 1907. Two scholars from the University of Christian II in Norway, Axel Holst and Theodor Frolic H., were studying another maritime ailment, Berberian urological disorder, now proven to be caused by thiamine deficiency. They sought to study the cause by inducing the disease in experimental animals, only to discover unexpectedly Axel Holst and Theodor Frolic H. of Christiania were investigating another seafarer's ailment, Berberi. This neurological disorder is now confirmed to be triggered by thiamine deficiency. They sought to study its pathogenesis by inducing the condition in experimental animals, initially successfully validating the pathological mechanism using pigeons. Subsequently, necessitated by their research, they switched to a new experimental subject, guinea pigs. The researchers maintained the guinea pig's diet solely on grain and water, anticipating they would exhibit the neurological symptoms of Berberi. Instead, they unexpectedly observed these animals gradually became exhausted. Their joints swelled, and subcutaneous hemorrhages began to appear. Upon dissection, Holston Frolic observed spongy, persistently bleeding gums, loose teeth, and brittle bones. These guinea pigs did not suffer from beriberi, but exhibited textbook symptoms of scurvy. This discovery was both a stroke of pure luck and a testament to profound scientific insight. Holston Frolic realized that most animals, including rats, dogs, and pigeons, could synthesize ascorbic acid internally and thus did not suffer from scurvy. However, a few species could not, including certain fruit bats, primates, and guinea pigs. Like humans, these creatures had lost the ability to synthesize this vital substance and must obtain it through their diet. Holston Frolic serendipitous established the first reliable animal model for scurvy, thereby embarking upon a genuine journey of discovery. They were able to test various foods on diseased guinea pigs and measure the results with scientific precision. They confirmed that fresh cabbage or lemon juice cured the animals, whereas cooked versions proved ineffective. This elusive component, ascorbic acid, was real, measurable, and remarkably fragile. In 1912, Polish biochemist Casimir Finkel proposed a revolutionary theory in London, studying diseases like beriberi and scurvy. He posited that these ailments stemmed from dietary deficiencies in vital micronutrients. He named these substances vitamins, a fusion of life and amine, stemming from his mistaken belief they belonged to the amine family of compounds. He identified causative agents for multiple diseases and demonstrated that scurvy likewise stemmed from deficiency in a specific anti-ascorbic IC vitamin. The term later simplified to vitamin. The quest had now shifted from pursuing vague principles or abstract novel qualities to a race to isolate the specific chemical substance vitamin C. Throughout the 1920s, laboratories worldwide pursued this elusive chemical spectropotent extract could be concentrated from lemon juice or cabbage, curing guinea pigs within days. Yet purification, crystallization, and structural determination proved extraordinarily difficult. The substance was highly unstable, readily destroyed by heat, oxygen, or metal contact. At this juncture, an eminent Hungarian biochemist emerged, Albert Szent-Georgi, who had not even been specifically pursuing vitamin C. Szent-Georgi was a restless, charismatic scientist, dedicated to understanding the fundamental processes of cellular respiration. During his work at Cambridge and later in the United States in the late 1920s, he isolated a potent producing agent, a substance capable of readily extracting electrons from bovine adrenal glands, oranges, and cabbage. He discovered this substance to be a sugar acid containing 6 carbon atoms, which he named hydronic acid. He recognized its biological significance, yet struggled to understand its function. This puzzle lingered for years until 1930, when he returned to his native Hungary to take up a post at the University of Szeged. Szeged, the world capital of paprika, presented a challenge street. George continued his hexosacid research, but faced a shortage of samples. The local abattoir's bovine adrenal glands yielded only trace amounts. A turning point arrived through near-minus divine coincidence. One evening, his wife served fresh red peppers. Low street. George disliked them and was about to discard them. He caught sight of the vivid red peppers and was struck by inspiration. He had never tested red peppers. That very night, he brought the peppers to his laboratory and was astonished to discover they were rich in hexahydroxy acid, a veritable gold mine. He had finally secured an inexpensive and inexhaustible source of raw material, enabling him to extract this chemical substance by the kilogram. In 1942, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Joseph Fesvey, at RBI, an American postdoctoral fellow working in the laboratory of Charles Glenn King, the leading authority on vitamin C research at the University of Pittsburgh, arrived in Sheeds to collaborate with Shent-Georgie, well-versed in vitamin C's properties through guinea pig experiments. Wearable collaborated with Shent-Georgie on the pivotal test. They extracted pure crystalline ascorbic acid samples from sheethed peppers, administered them to scurvy-stricken guinea pigs, and observed the animals' rapid recovery. The evidence was irrefutable. Ascorbic acid was indeed vitamin C. Almost simultaneously, Charles Glenn King's team in Pittsburgh reached the identical conclusion. After extracting pure crystalline ascorbic acid from sheethed peppers and administering it to scurvy-afflicted guinea pigs, they observed the animals' swift and complete recovery. Irrefutable. Ascorbic acid was vitamin C. Almost simultaneously, Charles Glenn King's team in Pittsburgh reached the identical conclusion. This ancient adversary finally possessed a face and a name. To emphasize its efficacy, St. George renamed the substance ascorbic acid, derived from the Latin meaning without, and scorbut scurvy, literally meaning anti-scurvy acid, for his contributions to cellular respiration research and this epic-making discovery. Albert St. George was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1937. Thus closed the long journey from the ghostly terror of shipholds to the established clinical syndrome, from naval logistical conundrums to terrestrial plagues, ultimately crystallizing into this simple, elegant hydrocarbon molecule CHO. Today we understand it can be synthesized artificially and encapsulated in pills. This centuries-long, arduous quest has finally unveiled the truth behind the ocean's terror within a crystalline chemical formula. Darkness shall be utterly dispelled by the light of science. If one were to believe the tale ends here, defeating the great foe, discovering a simple molecule capable of curbing the terrifying mechanism of cellular decay, such a perfect conclusion might herald progress, consigning the spectre to eternal slumber within yellowed logbooks and forgotten medical texts. Yet history seldom unfolds, so neatly spectres possess a stubborn tendency to linger. The beast of scurvy was not utterly vanquished. It was merely starved to the brink, driven into the world's darkest corners, banished into the shadows cast by our modern civilization, though it lay in wait for the fundamental vulnerability it exploited, the simple metabolic flaw that the human body cannot synthesize vitamin C, remained unchanged. Any one of us, regardless of background, could follow in the footsteps of Vasco da Gama sailors with merely weeks of severe neglect. The modern resurgence of scurvy unfolds like a silent plague, its narrative not etched in the dramatic scenes of entire fleets perishing, but in isolated case studies within medical journals and the hushed conversations of social workers. This is a paradoxical affliction. It ravages the world's most affluent nations, where supermarkets overflow with their freighted citrus fruits from every corner of the globe, where your round abundance is assured. It is the spectre of plenty, its predator lurking not upon the open seas but within quiet flats, in care homes, in sprawling, nameless suburbs. The ocean is no longer the wilderness. The new wilderness is the landscape of processed foods, what nutritionists grimly term the food desert, where fresh fruit and vegetables become scarce, expensive luxuries. The new isolation is not the vastness of the Pacific, but the solitude of old age, poverty, and mental illness. Consider the modern patient, not the weather-beaten, hollow-eyed old sailor, but the widowed old man in a small flat in London or Chicago. He survives on convenient, cheap tea, toast, tinned soup, and biscuits. His wife, who once managed the shopping and cooking, has passed away. He attributes his weariness and joint pains to advancing age. When his gums begin to ache, he blames ill-fitting dentures when dark purple bruises appear on his shins, like sombre blossoms blooming upon his pallid skin. He could not recall bumping into anything. He felt profound weariness, a fatigue that sleep could not cure. He was irritable. He was depressed. Doctors are trained to screen for complex modern ailments, heart disease, diabetes, cancer. Scurvy is a disease from the history books, a rare diagnostic case. Who would think of it nowadays? Yet the symptoms were identical. The same slow internal disintegration, collagen depletion, microscopic tendons fraying thread by thread. Consider the university students' plight, thousands of miles from home, wrestling with financial and academic pressures. Their diets grow increasingly monotonous, trapped in a tedious cycle of instant noodles, pizza, and energy drinks. This beige-minus unfair fuels anxiety, yet is blamed on academic stress. Hair becomes brittle and prone to breakage. Peculiar spiral patterns appear on the fine hairs of the arm. The body sends signals of weakness. These are ancient genetic distress signals, yet in an era saturated with information about countless ailments, this most fundamental nutritional cry is drowned out by the clamor. Developed nations do indeed have documented cases, patients suffering severe scurvy from a single nutrient deficiency, cured within days by merely a glass of orange juice and vitamin supplements. The remedy is laughably simple, yet its persistent existence renders the tragedy all the more acute. The spectre of scurvy still haunts hospital corridors, emerging alongside other struggles of modern society, manifesting in those with eating disorders like anorexia, where dietary restrictions deprive the body of essential nutrients, observed in individuals who have undergone weight-loss surgery, where altered digestion impairs nutrient absorption, afflicts chronic alcoholics, whose liquid-calorie diets replace all nutritious food, while alcohol itself interferes with the body's ability to utilize even minimal vitamin. See, it even manifests in children with autism spectrum disorders, who may exhibit extreme picky eating, sometimes refusing all fruit or vegetables. Though each case unfolds in a contemporary setting, its biological essence is ancient. When the body lacks ascorbic acid, it begins to consume itself. Capillary walls gradually weaken, leading to bleeding beneath the skin, within joints, and around organs. Old wounds, even surgical scars from decades prior, may mysteriously and horrificously reopen. As scar tissue, a patchwork of collagen dissolves from within. It is a silent internal collapse. Beyond the developed world, scurvy is no spectre but a grim, recurring reality in refugee camps, where millions displaced by war and famine face perpetual logistical battles for nutritional support. The slightest disruption in fragile supply chains, the briefest delay in fortified food shipments, or monotonous diets of grains or rice lacking vitamin supplementation, are sufficient to awaken this ancient adversary. Small scale scurvy outbreaks in Kenyan refugee camps or Syrian border settlements, like canaries in coal mines, signal fatal flaws in the humanitarian safety net. They warn of dangerous gaps in dietary patterns and foreshadow the quiet spread of other nutritional deficiencies whose initial symptoms are less alarming. This disease serves as a barometer of human suffering, its presence revealing the unbearable strain upon entire systems. It demonstrates that despite rapid technological advancement, humanity's most fundamental biological survival needs remain unchanged. We have constructed an extraordinarily complex world, yet remain vulnerable to collapse through the absence of a humble fruit. The terrors of the sea have been replaced by the silent despair of circumstance. The enemy remains. Only the battlefield has shifted. This protracted war against a hidden affliction has yielded not only scientific breakthroughs in public health policies, but has also stained our language, weaving itself into the cultural fabric. The scattered fragments of words and tales resemble the wreckage of a ship lost on distant shores. The memory of scurvy echoes in the vocabulary we use, the stories we tell, and even our national identities. A legacy inscribed in slang, literature, and geopolitical maps. Among these linguistic relics, none is more famous than the term lemmy, now often used affectionately or teasingly to refer to Britons. Its origins lied deep within the complex and cumbersome naval logistics of the 19th century. We recall James Linn's elegant 1747 lemon experiment and Gilbert Blythe's 1795 reluctant adoption of citric juice by the Admiralty. The Royal Navy's nutritional advantage, enabled by lemon juice, allowed indefinite blockades of Napoleonic ports and global power projection. Their dominance of the seas stemmed largely from their mastery of nutrition, yet policy shifted subtly in the mid-19th century, a nuanced yet devastating transformation that ultimately paralyzed the British fleet following the 1812 Starling incident. Their fleet could indefinitely blockade Napoleon's ports, projecting power across the globe. Their supremacy at sea was largely attributable to their command of nutritional science. Yet in the mid-19th century, a subtle yet devastating policy shift occurred. Britain began favoring green limes over yellow lemons as its primary scurvy remedy. The logic appeared sound. The British Empire possessed vast colonies in the West Indies, including Jamaica and Dominica, where limes grew abundantly. Importing lemons from Mediterranean nations like Spain and Italy proved more costly and politically sensitive. Why procure from potential adversaries when imperial gardens could supply them? Thus, the alternative was adopted. The Royal Navy and later, the British merchant fleet began consuming West Indian lime juice, a measure hailed as the pride of the empire. Yet it harbored a fatal flaw. Unforeseen at the time, the West Indian lime citrus or antifolia that contained far less vitamin C than the Mediterranean lemon citrus lemon. Precisely, only about half the amount. Worse still, the 19th century preservation method, storing juice in copper-lined wooden barrels, further destroyed the remaining ascorbic acid. The result was a catastrophic failure of public health policy. British sailors, diligently consuming their daily rations of lemon juice, once again succumbed to scurvy. During long voyages, outbreaks resurged as the remedy proved ineffective. Meanwhile, sailors aboard the expanding American Navy and merchant fleet, who often received lemon supplies or sailed shorter routes requiring less stringent preservation, remained healthier, observing their British counterparts, pale-faced, bleeding-gummed sailors reliant on inferior limes. The term limmy emerged. Far from praise, it was an insult. Dockyard slang across the seas meaning you sickly wretch, relying on useless medicine. This taunt, rooted in the harsh reality of scurvy, became deeply ingrained. Over time, its sharp edge blunted, evolving into a peculiar nickname. Yet scurvy's cultural imprint extends far beyond mere slang, hovering like storm clouds over the backdrop of great seafaring literature. It became the silent dread shaping the narrative in Herman Melville's Moby-Dick. The crew of the Pequod embarked on a voyage spanning years, a frenzied pursuit that pushed them beyond the conventional limits of whaling. Though Melville spares us gory details, the menace remains ever present. The crew's health a seething undercurrent of dread. He writes that whalers, after years at sea, inevitably become floating hospitals, rife with debilitation and death. The true monsters of the voyage were not merely the white whales, but the internal decay threatening every sailor. The pursuit of whale oil, the fuel of the 19th century, was perpetually a race against the dwindling resources within their own bodies. Consider Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, where the pirate crew marooned on the island begin to fall ill. Stevenson describes one man shivering, yet scorched by a high fever, but another character diagnoses the true cause with chilling certainty. He's gone mad. He says, "But if you ask what killed him, I'd say it was the rum, the climate, and the long watches. Such torment would have done a sturdier man in." This alludes to how prolonged watch duty signified extended sea voyages and chronic deprivation of fresh food. Despite their predatory nature and insatiable greed, pirates proved as vulnerable as ordinary sailors, ultimately succumbing to scurvy. a disease that, like a force of nature or a messenger of justice, decimated their ranks with the precision of a musket volley. It lends these tales of adventurous umber realism, reminding us that the deadliest threat on the open seas is seldom cannonballs or sea monsters, but a simple lack of fruit. This protracted battle against nutritional deprivation profoundly shaped the fate of empires. The nation that could safeguard its sailors' health would command the waves. During the pivotal period from the late 18th to the mid-19th century, that nation was Britain. The successful implementation of the lemon juice rationing system granted the Royal Navy's staggering strategic advantage. Its fleet could impose a tight blockade on enemy ports for months, even years. Napoleon's French fleet remained trapped in ports like Brest and Toulon, when sailors were confined to harbour or launched brief, desperate raids. They suffered from diseases caused by lack of activity and poor sanitation. Meanwhile, British crews patrolling coastal waters remained robust as oxen. This naval supremacy, achieved at the cost of vitamin C, proved pivotal to Napoleon's eventual downfall, enabling Britain to dominate global shipping lanes, safeguarding its own trade while crippling enemy commerce. The prolonged voyages further catalyzed the final great age of exploration. Captain James Cook's epic Pacific crossing represented not only a triumph of navigation and science, but also a victory for logistics and public health. Cook was obsessively dedicated to his crew's health, though he erroneously attributed scurvy prevention to factors like portable soups and more, insisting on cleanliness and, crucially, compelling his men to consume fresh vegetables and sauerkraut whenever possible. This resulted in scurvy-related death among his crew being exceedingly rare. This very success enabled him to chart vast uncharted territories stretching from Australia to the Hawaiian Island, from the Antarctic Circle to the Alaskan coast. He and his crew could sail the seas for years, mapping the world precisely, because they discovered a way to delay bodily collapse. Thus scurvy not only affected sailors' health, but also delineated boundaries on the maps we use today. The conquest of disease was inextricably linked to the conquest of the world. It was the secret ingredient of empire, the invisible hand guiding the fate of fleets and nations. Here we reach the end of this circuitous voyage, setting sail from the shores of ancient Egypt, traversing the age of exploration, entering the meticulous world of 18th-century naval surgeon. We finally arrive at a quiet corner of the modern age, where the spectre of disease still lingers. Our tale bears witness to profound suffering and ignorance, chronicling the slow and painful dawn of understanding. This is humanity's journey to end the oldest and most devastating of afflictions, revealing that ultimate conquest is not a single feat, but a puzzle pieced together over centuries, a victory born in laboratories and forged upon bridge decks. It is the epic of overcoming cellular collapse, the turning point in this protracted war. The moment that truly altered the course of the conflict was not a fierce naval battle, but a quiet, meticulous experiment conducted in the down, cramped quarters of a British warship. In 1747, aboard the HMS Salisbury patrolling the English Channel, a man named James Lind, a Scottish naval surgeon's assistant, possessed keen observation skills and, more crucially, a revolutionary idea how to uncover truth amidst the clamour of pseudoscience and traditional myths. Having witnessed too many sailors succumb to illness and seen the ineffectiveness of traditional remedies, he resolved to conduct an experiment. He selected 12 sailors suffering from scurvy, all afflicted with putrid gums, dark spots, and extreme debility, and confined them to the same ship's cabin, the sick bay, providing them with identical basic rations. He then divided them into 4 groups. Group 1 consumed 1 quart of cider daily. Group 2 took 20-5 drops of ammonium sulfate, commonly known as arsenic, 3 times daily. Group 3 ingested 2 spoonfuls of vinegar daily. Group 4 drank half a pint of seawater daily. Group 5 applied an ointment containing herbs such as garlic and mustard seeds, and finally, the fortunate 6th group received 2 oranges and 1 lemon daily. The experimental results, in Lin's own modest phrasing, were as follows. The most pronounced therapeutic effect emerged within 6 days. The 2 sailors consuming citrus recovered and returned to duty tending to the sick. The cider group showed slight improvement, while the others continued to deteriorate slowly. The evidence was irrefutable, clear, simple, and elegant. The cure for scurvy was indeed citrus fruit. Yet, as we shall see, this astonishing discovery was not the end of the story. The British Admiralty, an institution notoriously resistant to change, took 40-8 years to adopt lemon juice as standard rations. Lin's discovery was obstructed by bureaucratic inertia and the chaotic medical theories of the time. Even Lin himself failed to fully grasp the significance of his experiment, mistakenly believing the fruit worked by cleansing the body rather than replenishing missing nutrients. Yet the seeds of new thinking had been sown. The concept of studying disease and validating treatments through fair, controlled experiments. This approach utterly overturned traditional medicine, rooted in humoral balance and speculative theories. The quest to combat scurvy not only saved sailors but gave birth to the methodology of evidence-based medicine, the very foundation of all modern medical practice. The final piece of the puzzle, the true cause behind the cure, would not be revealed until the emergence of biochemistry as a new science in the 20th century. The hero of this chapter was neither sailor nor surgeon, but the Hungarian scientist Albert Schent-Georgi. From the late 1920s to the early 1930s, he researched cellular respiration, the process by which cells convert nutrients into energy, first at Cambridge University, and later in his native Hungary. He successfully isolated a mysterious substance from adrenal glands and plants, such as cabbage and red peppers, discovering its potent reducing properties, i.e. its ability to readily donate electrons. He initially named it hexahydroxy acid. He hypothesized that this substance could promote vitamin synthesis and successfully extracted vitamin C from plants, the process of converting nutrients into energy. He successfully isolated a mysterious substance from adrenal glands and plants such as cabbage and peppers, discovering its strong reducing properties, its ability to readily release electrons. He initially named it hexose acid, suspecting its role in preventing scurvy, though he was unable to prove this. The breakthrough came when he sent samples to British chemist Walter Norman Howarth, who successfully deciphered its chemical structure. Together, they renamed it ascorbic acid, literally meaning ascorbic acid, the acid that prevents scurvy. The literal meaning is ascorbic acid, preventing scurvy. Thus, the principle behind combating scurvy ceased to be a vague concept or the miraculous property of fruit, becoming instead the clearly identifiable molecule C6H26. The mystery was finally solved. The key lay not in the acidity or cleansing properties of fruit, but in this specific compound. Most mammals can synthesize it themselves in the liver, but humans, other primates, and guinea pigs cannot. This ancient flaw in our DNA has been the vulnerability exploited by scurvy for millennia. With the isolation and synthetic production of vitamin C, treatment no longer depended on the fragile supply chains of lemons or limes. It could be manufactured in factories, made into stable tablets shipped worldwide, and fortified into national food supplies by adding it to flour, milk, and fruit juices. Not only had this beast been tamed, but its very essence had been captured and understood. The saga of scurvy is not merely the epic of a single disease, but a profound allegory of human progress. It chronicles how we learned to discern the subtle link between sailors' diets and the health, the value of controlled experiments, which separate hypothesis from truth, the invisible world built of molecules, and the understanding that the human body is a precise chemical engine with uncompromising specific demands. Conquering this affliction not only revolutionized nutrition science and laid the foundations for clinical trial methodology, but also transformed strategic approaches, ultimately facilitating global cartography and colonial expansion. It transformed the vast oceans from a dreaded graveyard into a highway for commerce and discovery. This tale reminds us that the greatest triumphs often begin with simple observation, with the courage to question convention, with the humility to recognize that sometimes the cure for the world's afflictions lies hidden within a single fruit. When the internal mechanism of collapse was finally revealed, we discovered not only a remedy, but also forged new laws of navigation.